Welcome back, everybody, to The Deep Dive. You know we like to go deep on this show, and today we're diving into something I think everybody wants more of: productivity. We've got a whole stack of research here and advice from experts about how to work with our brains instead of against them. I don't know about you, but I am ready to get a lot more done and a lot less stressed while I'm doing it.
You're in luck, because a lot of what we think we know about productivity is actually wrong. So we're going to debunk some of the biggest myths out there, and then we're going to give you some real science-backed strategies that'll help you actually boost your output.
I am so ready to ditch the to-do list staring contest. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Let's start with one of the biggest myths out there: the idea that productivity is all about willpower, that if we just try harder, we can power through anything.
Oh, tell me about it. I have definitely fallen into that trap before, thinking that the only thing standing between me and, like, superhuman productivity is just a little bit more discipline.
But here's the thing. Willpower is like a muscle. It gets tired, especially when you've been using it a lot. So relying solely on willpower to get things done, it can actually backfire, leading to burnout, and then you're actually less productive in the long run.
So what's the alternative? If it's not about just white-knuckling our way through the day, how do we actually get things done?
Okay, so think about it this way. If you were training to run a marathon, you wouldn't just sprint at the start and hope for the best. Right?
Definitely not.
No, you'd pace yourself. You'd conserve your energy. You'd work with your body's natural limits.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. Are you saying we need to treat our brains like athletes in training?
Exactly. Productivity is about understanding your brain's strengths and weaknesses and working with those natural rhythms instead of fighting against them. One of the key things to understand here is that our brains operate in cycles, like waves of energy.
You're talking about those like natural 90-minute cycles, right? I feel like I've heard about this.
Precisely. These are called Ultradian rhythms, and they're a fundamental part of how our brains function. We go through these periods of high alertness, followed by these natural dips in energy. So ignoring these cycles is like trying to swim upstream. It's exhausting, and ultimately, it's just inefficient.
So instead of trying to power through for hours on end, we should be working in shorter, more focused bursts, aligned with these natural rhythms.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of working in sprints comes in. You know, a lot of elite performers have figured out how to tap into these cycles by working in these intense 90-minute bursts, followed by a short break to kind of recharge.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. We need to work with our brain's natural rhythms, not against them. But what about those times when we really need to focus, but our brain is just not cooperating? Are there any tricks to make those tough tasks feel a little bit less daunting?
Absolutely. And this is where we get to another fascinating psychological phenomenon. It's called the Zeigarnik effect.
I think I've heard of that. Does it have something to do with, like, unfinished tasks?
Exactly. The Zeigarnik effect describes our brain's tendency to fixate on incomplete tasks. You know, it's that nagging feeling you get when you start a project, but you don't finish it, or like that urge to finish a movie, even if it's terrible.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. So how can we actually use this to our advantage when it comes to productivity?
Well, knowing that our brains crave closure, we can actually leverage this. One way is to intentionally leave tasks partially finished.
Wait, really? Intentionally not finish something? That sounds counterintuitive.
It might seem strange, but hear me out. When you leave a task unfinished, you create this sort of mental tension that makes you more likely to come back and complete it later.
So it's like planting a little seed in our minds that keeps nagging us until we take action. Clever. Are there any other ways that we can work with our brain's natural tendencies to boost our productivity?
Absolutely. Let's talk about the power of rituals.
Rituals, like those elaborate morning routines you see on Instagram.
Well, not necessarily. A ritual doesn't have to be complicated. It's simply about creating specific, repeatable actions that signal to your brain to shift into a particular state of mind.
Because it's like an on switch for productivity.
Exactly. For example, a simple ritual could be as easy as clearing your desk, putting on your headphones, and then playing a specific type of music to signal to your brain that it's time to focus.
I like that. It's about creating those mental associations and cues that trigger our brains into action.
Precisely. Another powerful ritual is the Ohio principle. Only handle it once. This is often used for email management, but it can apply to any task, really.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this Ohio thing.
Okay, so it's simple but effective. The idea is that when you encounter a task, you make a decision about it right then, and you take action. So you either complete it, delegate it, schedule it for later, or discard it.
So it's about eliminating that back and forth, that indecision that can just drain our energy and time.
Exactly. Ohio is about making a conscious choice and then moving on. This helps to streamline your workflow and prevent tasks from piling up and causing overwhelm.
I can definitely see how that would be helpful. Any other rituals that you recommend?
Well, this one might seem obvious, but it's incredibly powerful. Write things down.
Seriously, just the act of writing something down makes us more productive.
Research has shown that simply writing down our tasks and intentions makes us far more likely to follow through. It's like creating a physical commitment to ourselves, like a tangible reminder of what we need to do.
Okay, I'm sold. I'm grabbing my notebook right now. But let's move on to a topic that I think a lot of people struggle with, multitasking. Is it a superpower or a productivity killer?
Unfortunately, the science is pretty clear on this one. Multitasking is a myth. Our brains simply aren't designed to effectively focus on multiple tasks at once.
But I feel like I multitask all the time. Am I doing it wrong?
You're not alone. What we often call multitasking is actually task switching. It's like rapidly jumping between different activities. And every time we switch, there's a cognitive cost. There's a little lag in our brain's processing power.
So every time we switch between checking email and working on a project, we're actually losing focus and efficiency.
Exactly. And over time, those small losses add up to a significant productivity drain. Think of it like having a bunch of tabs open on your computer. The more tabs you have open, the slower your computer runs.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So the key is to focus on one thing at a time. What's the term for that again?
Monotasking. It might sound simple, but in our hyper-connected world, it's a skill that requires practice. Think of it like giving your brain a superpower boost by allowing it to fully engage with a single task.
I am definitely on board with the monotasking movement. But in the real world, distractions are everywhere. How do we actually make monotasking work?
That's where the power of time blocking comes in. This technique involves scheduling specific blocks of time for particular tasks, just like you would schedule a meeting.
So it's about creating a structure for our day that minimizes those tempting distractions.
Exactly. By allocating dedicated time slots for specific activities, we're less likely to get sidetracked by all those shiny objects that are constantly vying for our attention.
This is brilliant. I am already starting to rethink my entire work schedule.
That's the power of understanding the science behind productivity. We can leverage these insights to work smarter, not harder.
Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground already, and I don't want to overload our listeners' brains.
Good point. Let's take a pause here, and when we come back, we'll delve into even more strategies for maximizing your productivity, including how to hack your brain's reward system and tame those digital distractions.
I'm looking forward to it. All right, so we're back and ready to dive even deeper into the science of productivity. Before the break, we were talking about some pretty powerful strategies like monotasking and time blocking. But I'm curious, are there any techniques that can help us tackle those big, important tasks? You know, the ones that we tend to procrastinate on, the ones that just feel a bit overwhelming.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of how our brains work, the reward system.
Okay, tell me more about this. How can we, hack our brain's reward system to actually make those tough tasks more appealing?
Well, think about what motivates us. Our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And that applies to our work habits as well. We get a little hit of dopamine, like feel-good neurotransmitter, when we complete tasks, especially those that are easy and provide a quick sense of accomplishment.
So like checking things off our to-do list, or finally clearing out our inbox.
Exactly. But here's the problem. Those quick dopamine hits can actually train our brains to prefer low-impact tasks, or what some productivity experts call LITs, over those more challenging high-impact tasks, or MITs.
So those little dopamine hits are actually working against us, making us crave the easy stuff instead of the important stuff.
Precisely. And that's why so many of us struggle with procrastination. Our brains are constantly seeking those quick rewards, even if they don't actually contribute to our long-term goals.
This is starting to make a lot of sense. It's like our brains are tricking us into prioritizing the tasks that feel good in the moment, but don't actually move the needle in a meaningful way.
Exactly. So how do we break free from this cycle? Well, one effective strategy is to be more intentional about how we prioritize our tasks. Instead of letting those quick dopamine hits dictate our workflow, we need to consciously focus on our MITs, those tasks that will have the biggest impact on our overall productivity and success.
Okay, that makes sense. But those big, important tasks, they can feel so daunting. How do we make them less intimidating and more appealing to our dopamine-seeking brains?
Here's a little trick. Make your MITs feel more like LITs.
Wait, what? How do we do that?
Well, think about what makes those LITs so appealing. They're usually quick, easy, and they provide a sense of closure, right?
Yeah, totally. It's that satisfying feeling of checking something off our to-do list.
Exactly. So try breaking down your MITs into smaller, more manageable chunks. This will make them feel less daunting and more approachable.
So it's like tricking our brains into thinking those big, scary tasks are actually a series of smaller, more rewarding tasks. I like that.
Exactly. And you can even reward yourself after completing each chunk, further reinforcing that positive association.
Okay, this is starting to feel like a game. We're learning how to play our own brains.
Right.
Now let's talk about something that I think a lot of people struggle with, especially in today's hyper-connected world. It's this feeling of needing to be constantly available. How do we balance productivity with boundaries? Especially when it feels like we're always expected to be on.
That's a crucial point. And it's especially relevant for those who work remotely or in flexible work environments. The lines between work time and personal time can become blurred, leading to a sense of always being on call.
Exactly. It's like the pressure to be available 24/7 never goes away.
Right, and this can lead to something called hyper-responsiveness, where we feel compelled to respond to every email, message, or notification immediately.
Oh, I'm definitely guilty of that. I get a little dopamine rush every time I see a new email in my inbox.
It's a common trap. But constantly checking and responding to messages throughout the day, it creates those costly task switches that we talked about earlier.
Right. Every time we switch our attention, we pay that mental fee, draining our energy and our focus. So how do we break free from this always-on mentality without sacrificing productivity?
One solution is to embrace the power of asynchronous communication.
Asynchronous communication. That sounds complicated. What does that even mean?
It's actually quite simple. Asynchronous communication means that you don't have to respond to messages in real time. It's about giving yourself permission to disconnect, batch your responses, and work in a way that respects your natural rhythms.
So it's like setting boundaries for our work time and communication.
Exactly. Instead of constantly checking and responding to messages throughout the day, you can designate specific times to batch your responses. For example, you might check and respond to emails twice a day, or set aside a block of time each week to catch up on messages.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could work. But what if something urgent comes up?
That's where clear communication comes in. Let people know your preferred communication style and response times. And if something is truly urgent, they can always reach you by phone.
This is a game changer. I can already feel the stress melting away just thinking about having more control over my communication flow.
That's the beauty of asynchronous communication. It allows you to work more efficiently and reduce stress by minimizing those constant interruptions and task switches.
This is amazing. Okay, so we've talked about working with our brains instead of against them, hacking our reward system, and embracing asynchronous communication. But are there any other strategies that can help us optimize our environment, maximum focus and productivity?
Absolutely. Let's talk about the power of our surroundings. We often underestimate how much our environment can impact our ability to focus and concentrate.
So it's not just about willpower and mental strategies. Our physical surroundings matter too.
More than you might think. And here's where things get a bit counterintuitive. You might think that a silent room is the ideal environment for focus. But it turns out that greenery, like plants or even views of nature, can actually be more restorative for our mental energy.
Wait, so staring at a wall is less productive than looking at a tree? That's fascinating.
It's true. Our brains are constantly bombarded with stimuli, and looking at nature provides a kind of mental break that allows us to replenish our focus.
Okay, I'm adding buy more plants to my to-do list. What about music? Is that a distraction or a productivity booster?
That's a great question, and the answer is, it depends. For some people, silence is golden, but for others, background music, especially certain types, can actually enhance focus.
Like what kind of music? Give me some examples.
Well, video game soundtracks are a popular choice. They're designed to be engaging but not distracting, so they keep your brain stimulated, while allowing you to focus on the task at hand.
Wait, video game music? Seriously?
Think about it. Video game music is meant to keep you engaged and in the flow while you're playing. That same principle can apply to work.
Okay, my mind is blown. So it's like giving our unconscious mind something to play with, while our conscious mind tackles the to-do list.
Exactly. And if you're working in a noisy environment, noise-canceling headphones can be a lifesaver.
This is awesome. So many practical tips already, and I'm feeling more productive just listening to this. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about a productivity killer that often goes unnoticed: Muddled associations.
Muddled associations. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about? Well, our brains are incredibly good at creating associations. Think about how certain smells or sounds can trigger memories or emotions.
Oh yeah, totally. Like
Yeah.
the smell of freshly baked cookies. Always reminds me of my grandma's house.
Exactly. But those same associative powers can work against us when it comes to productivity. For example, if you're used to working from your couch, your brain might start associating that space with relaxation rather than focus.
So our brains are like couch equals Netflix, not spreadsheets.
Pretty much. And those muddled associations can make it really hard to get into a productive mindset.
Okay, so how do we avoid those productivity sabotaging associations? Especially like when working from home.
One of the most effective strategies is to create a dedicated workspace, a physical space that your brain comes to associate with work and focus.
So like having a designated home office, or even just a specific spot at the kitchen table, that's only for work.
Exactly. And if you don't have the luxury of a separate workspace, you can use sensory cues to help create those associations. For example, try lighting a specific candle or playing a particular type of music, only when you're working.
So it's like training our brains to shift into work mode when we encounter those cues.
Exactly. And you can do the same thing to signal the end of your workday. For example, you could dim the lights, switch to a different playlist, or even change your clothes to help your brain transition out of work mode.
I love these ideas. It's amazing how these subtle cues can have such a big impact on our productivity.
Absolutely. And these strategies are especially important when we're dealing with the constant barrage of sensory distractions in our modern world.
Ooh, this is a good one. Distractions are everywhere. How do we keep them from hijacking our focus?
Well, the first step is understanding that our brains, they're hardwired to be constantly scanning our environment for anything potentially relevant or important.
So it's not our fault that we're so easily distracted. It's just how our brains are wired.
In a way, yes. But knowing this, we can proactively protect our sensory systems from overload. For visual distractions, this could mean creating a physical barrier, like facing a wall or using a privacy screen.
So it's like creating a visual cocoon for our focus.
Exactly. And for auditory distractions, noise-canceling headphones can be a game changer. Or, as we discussed earlier, background music, especially instrumental music, or music with lyrics in a language you don't understand can actually help to mask distracting noises.
This is making me realize just how much I underestimate the impact of my environment on my productivity. It's not just about willpower. It's about creating a space that supports focus.
Precisely. And speaking of supporting focus, one of the biggest drains on our mental energy is something we all carry with us, our smartphones.
Oh, here we go. The smartphone lecture. But seriously, I know I'm addicted, but what can I do about it?
Well, the first step is awareness. And here's a scary thought. Studies have shown that the mere presence of a smartphone, even if it's turned off, can reduce our cognitive capacity.
Wait, seriously? Just having my phone nearby is making me dumber.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it? But the research is pretty clear on this. Our brains are constantly tempted by the potential rewards and information our phones offer, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
So what's the solution? Do we all need to go off the grid to be truly productive?
That's not very practical for most people. But we can be more mindful of our phone habits during those focus sprints. Keep your phone out of sight, ideally in a different room.
Out of sight, out of mind, right. But what about those times when we do need to use our phones for work?
Great question. And here's a simple but effective strategy. Batch your phone use. Instead of constantly checking messages and notifications throughout the day, designate specific times to catch up on emails, social media, or other phone-related tasks.
So it's about creating boundaries for our phone time, just like we create boundaries for our work time.
Exactly. And by batching those activities, we minimize those constant task switches that drain our mental energy. We've covered a lot of ground today, from understanding our brain's natural rhythms to taming those digital distractions.
I know, right? It's a lot to take in. But I feel like I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Productivity isn't about some magical formula or superhuman willpower. It's about understanding how our brains work, and then using that knowledge to create a work style that aligns with our natural rhythms and supports our goals.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, before we wrap up, let's recap the key takeaways for our listeners.
All right, so let's do a quick recap of everything we talked about today.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. We started by talking about willpower and how it's not this magical thing we can just crank up whenever we want.
Right, it's more like a muscle that gets tired if you overuse it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to work with our brain's natural rhythms, like those ultradian cycles that we talked about. They basically dictate our energy levels throughout the day.
And those cycles tell us that working in sprints is way more effective than just trying to power through for hours on end. I mean, think about it. Who's ever actually done their best work after like hour 3 or 4 of nonstop work?
Right, you're just setting yourself up for burnout at that point.
Exactly. Oh, and remember the Zeigarnik effect. Our brain's weird obsession with unfinished tasks.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. We can actually use that to our advantage by intentionally leaving tasks partially finished. It creates this mental tension that makes us more likely to come back and finish it later.
It's like our brains just can't stand the thought of something being incomplete.
And then we talked about rituals and how they can be like these little mental cues that tell our brains it's time to get to work.
I'm a big fan of that one. Like just clearing off my desk and putting on my headphones, like flipping a switch in my brain.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about multitasking? We got to talk about that. I feel like so many people still think it's like a superpower.
Oh, it's definitely a myth. Our brains are just not wired to focus on multiple things at once. What we call multitasking is really just task switching. And all that switching back and forth, it just drains our mental energy.
Right, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. So instead of multitasking, we should focus on monotasking, which is basically just giving our full attention to one thing at a time.
And a great way to support monotasking is with time blocking, which is like scheduling blocks of time for specific tasks.
I've been experimenting with that lately, and I gotta say, it really makes a difference.
I think so too. It just helps to create that structure and minimizes distractions.
Okay, so then we got into the nitty-gritty of our brain's reward system and how it can sometimes work against us.
Right, those quick dopamine hits we get from checking things off our to-do list, they can actually make us crave those low-impact tasks instead of focusing on the bigger, more important stuff.
Yeah, it's like our brains are always looking for the easy way out. But we learned some pretty cool strategies for hacking that reward system, like breaking down those big tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Exactly. And then you can even reward yourself after completing each chunk.
To further reinforce that positive association.
Right, and we talk about dealing with that always-on feeling.
Especially in today's hyper-connected world.
And that's where asynchronous communication comes in. It's basically about setting boundaries for our communication and working in a way that respects our natural rhythms.
It's so freeing to realize that we don't have to be available 24/7. And then we explored how our physical environment can impact our productivity.
Right, like having plants in our workspace or listening to video game music. Who knew that could actually be a productivity booster?
Seriously, my mind was blown. And we wrapped up by talking about the importance of creating a dedicated workspace and using sensory cues to signal to our brains when it's time to focus and when it's time to relax.
Ooh, we covered a lot.
I know, right? But it's amazing how much we can learn from just paying attention to how our brains work.
I think the biggest takeaway here is that productivity isn't about finding some magical formula. It's about working with our brains, not against them.
Absolutely. So to all of our listeners out there, what one change are you most excited to try based on what you learned today? Let us know on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, stay curious, stay productive, and keep those brains buzzing.
Bye, everyone.